Pennsylvania, 1947. The small town of Haverbrook, nestled among rolling hills, had seen its share of harsh winters, but none as unforgiving as the one that brought Thomas Miller to the abandoned Victorian mansion on Cypress Lane. Snow fell in thick blankets as Thomas pulled his battered Ford truck to the curb, staring up at what would be his new home, a hulking silhouette against the grey sky, all sharp angles and darkened windows. At 38, Thomas was no stranger to hardship. The war had left him with a slight limp and nightmares that still jolted him awake in cold sweats. But it had also left him with enough money to purchase this once grand home at a price that seemed too good to be true. "It's been vacant since 38, the real estate agent had told him nervously, keys jangling in his hand. "The last owners just left. Everything still inside. Furniture, belongings, everything." Thomas didn't care about the rumors. He needed a fresh start after losing Sarah in childbirth just 6 months prior. His infant daughter Emma needed a home, and he needed distance from Pittsburgh's smoke-filled skies and pitying glances. The front door creaked open, releasing the stale scent of neglect. Thomas stepped inside, cradling Emma against his chest. The foyer was grand, with a sweeping staircase that curved upward to the second floor. Dust-covered furniture sat like patient ghosts beneath yellowed sheets. "What do you think, little one?" Thomas whispered to his sleeping daughter. "It needs work, but it's ours now." A sharp gust of wind slammed the door behind him. Thomas flinched, then chuckled at his own jumpiness. He moved deeper into the house, footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. The previous owners had indeed left everything behind. In the parlor, books still lined shelves. In the kitchen, dishes were stacked neatly in cabinets. It was as if the family had vanished midlife, leaving only emptiness behind. As the afternoon light waned, Thomas made his way upstairs to choose bedrooms. The master bedroom was spacious, with a 4-poster bed and heavy curtains. He placed Emma in the center of the bed, surrounding her with pillows, while he brought in their few belongings from the truck. It was during his 3rd trip upstairs that Thomas noticed the portrait gallery lining the upstairs hallway. 7 paintings hung in ornate frames, each depicting a different person. They were beautifully rendered, capturing not just appearances, but something deeper, her essence. The subjects ranged from an elderly man with stern eyes to a young woman whose gentle smile seemed almost alive. Thomas paused before the last frame, empty except for blank canvas. Curious, he checked behind it, wondering if the painting had fallen, but found nothing. "Strange choice of decoration," he muttered. From the bedroom, Emma began to cry. Thomas hurried to comfort her, pushing thoughts of the empty frame from his mind. They had work to do to make this house livable. Later that night, after settling Emma in a makeshift crib beside his bed, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the deed to the house. The previous owners, the Reynolds family, had sold it to the bank after the stock market crash. But according to town records, they'd never actually left Haverbrook. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Thomas didn't notice the soft, almost imperceptible sound of brushstrokes coming from the upstairs hallway. Thomas spent the next 3 weeks making the house habitable. He scrubbed years of grime from windows, repaired leaking pipes, and slowly uncovered the mansion's faded grandeur. The local hardware store owner, Bill Kinsey, became his first friend in Haverbrook, offering advice and occasional help with the heavier tasks. "You've picked yourself quite the project," Bill commented one afternoon, helping Thomas replace rotted porch boards. "Most folks around here wouldn't go near the old Miller place." "Reynolds," Thomas corrected. "The Reynolds family owned it before me." Bill gave him an odd look. "No, sir. It's always been the Miller house, built by Jeremiah Miller back in 1868. Reynolds were just the last to live here." Thomas shrugged off the discrepancy. Names didn't matter. Making this place a home did. Emma was thriving despite the cold and isolation. At 9 months, she was attempting to crawl, her chubby hands grasping at everything within reach. Thomas had converted a small room adjacent to his bedroom into a nursery. painting the walls a soft yellow and hanging curtains to keep out drafts. One evening, as Thomas was stoking the fire in the living room, a knock at the door startled him. Few people visited, especially after dark. He opened the door to find an elderly woman bundled against the cold, her eyes bright in a deeply lined face. "Mr. Miller," she said, not a question, but a confirmation. "I'm Edith Blackwood. I live down on Orchard Street." Thomas invited her in, curious about this unexpected visitor. "I won't stay," she said, remaining on the porch. "Just thought I should welcome you properly, and warn you. Warn me. This house has a history, Mr. Miller. People who live here don't tend to stay long." Her eyes drifted to Emma, who was playing on a blanket near the fire. "Especially those with young ones." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Blackwood, but we're doing just fine." She nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his dismissal. "Just remember, if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, don't ignore it. This house notices things too." Before Thomas could respond, she placed a small cloth bundle in his hand. "Hang this above your daughter's crib," she instructed, then turned and walked back into the night. Thomas unwrapped the bundle to find dried herbs tied with twine. He nearly tossed it into the fire. He had no patience for superstition, but something stopped him. Instead, he tucked it into his pocket and returned to Emma. That night, Thomas dreamed of the portrait gallery. In his dream, he walked the upstairs hallway, studying each face. The subject's eyes followed him, lips moving in silent whispers. When he reached the empty frame, it wasn't empty anymore. A shadow was taking shape on the canvas, formless, but growing more distinct with each passing moment. He awoke with a gasp, Emma's cries piercing the darkness. Disoriented, he stumbled to her crib, lifting her into his arms. As he soothed her back to sleep, Thomas couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. In the morning, he discovered that the herbs Mrs. Blackwood had given him were now hanging above Emma's crib, though he had no memory of placing them there. February brought a brief thaw that allowed Thomas to repair the leaking roof. From his perch on a ladder, he could see much of Haverbrook spread below. Neat rows of houses, the church steeple, and beyond them, rolling farmland stretching toward distant mountains. The isolation that had initially attracted him now felt oppressive. Inside, the house was slowly revealing its secrets. Behind a stuck drawer in the study, Thomas found a journal belonging to Catherine Reynolds, dated 1937. The entries were mundane at first, accounts of social calls, weather observations, recipes. But as Thomas read further, the tone changed. March 18th, 1937. James swears he heard footsteps in the attic again last night. I told him it's just the house settling, but he insists. The children are frightened. Perhaps we should have listened to the warnings. April 2nd, 1937. Another portrait has appeared. This makes 6. Mrs. Blackwood says they've always been there, but I know this isn't true. When we moved in 4 years ago, there were only 3. May 15th, 1937. James has fallen ill. The doctor can't determine the cause. He grows weaker each day. The children and I have taken to sleeping downstairs away from that hallway. The final entry sent a chill through Thomas. June 8th, 1937. James passed this morning. God rest his soul. I found a new portrait in the hallway. It's him, exactly as he looked in life. We're leaving today. I won't spend another night in this house. Thomas closed the journal, troubled. He recalled the portrait gallery, 7 paintings, not 6 as Catherine had described, plus the empty frame. Had another family lived here after the Reynolds? His thoughts were interrupted by Emma's babbling through the baby monitor. Thomas hurried to her nursery, where she sat in her crib, pointing excitedly at the corner of the room. "What is it, sweetheart?" Thomas asked, seeing nothing. Emma continued to point and babble, her expression shifting from delight to confusion. Thomas lifted her, feeling a distinct cold spot as he passed through the corner she'd been indicating. That evening, Thomas invited Bill Kinsey for dinner, hoping for casual conversation about the house's history. "So who lived here after the Reynolds family?" Thomas asked as they ate. Bill looked uncomfortable. "No one officially. Bank owned it until you came along. But there are 7 portraits upstairs. Catherine Reynolds mentioned only 6 in her journal, and that was after her husband died." Bill set down his fork. "Listen, Thomas, I'm not one for ghost stories, but this house, it has a reputation. They say when someone dies here, a new portrait appears in that hallway. That's why no one would buy it. 7 portraits, 7 deaths." Thomas laughed, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. "And I suppose the empty frame is waiting for number 8. Bill didn't smile. "I'd take Emma and leave, if I were you." After Bill left, Thomas climbed the stairs to the portrait gallery. The paintings seemed to glow in the dim light, each face more lifelike than he remembered. He stopped before the empty frame, studying the blank canvas. As he turned to leave, Thomas swore he saw a faint outline beginning to form, the suggestion of a face with his own features. March arrived with relentless rain that tapped against windows like impatient fingers. Thomas had taken to sleeping poorly, jolted awake by creaking floorboards or distant thuds. During daylight hours, he convinced himself it was merely an old house settling, but darkness brought doubts. Emma, now nearly a year old, had developed an unsettling habit. She would stare intently at empty corners of rooms, sometimes giggling, sometimes crying in fear. Thomas found himself following her gaze, searching for whatever captivated her, but saw nothing. "She's at that age," the town doctor assured him during Emma's checkup. "Babies have active imaginations," but Thomas wasn't convinced it was imagination. Too many unexplained occurrences plagued their days. Objects moved when he wasn't looking. Doors he'd closed would be open minutes later, and the temperature in certain rooms would plummet without warning, regardless of the roaring fires he maintained. His research into the house's history continued, leading him to the town's small library. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, helped him locate archived newspapers. "The Miller house has quite the past," she remarked, placing a stack of yellowed papers before him, not all of it fit to print. The articles told a grim story. Jeremiah Miller, the original owner, had died under mysterious circumstances in 1875. His widow followed 3 years later. Their son and his wife perished in a fire that damaged part of the house in 1892. A banker who purchased the property died of an apparent heart attack in 1918. His nephew, who inherited the house, fell down the main staircase, breaking his neck in 1924. And James Reynolds, whose death Catherine had documented in her journal, made 7. Thomas pushed the newspapers away, suddenly nauseous. 7 deaths, 7 portraits. "There's more," Dorothy said quietly. "Rumors, mostly. They say Jeremiah Miller was involved in something unnatural. He was obsessed with preserving life, with capturing souls." "Capturing souls," Thomas repeated skeptically. "In his portraits. He was a gifted painter. Some said too gifted." She leaned closer. "They say he made a deal to preserve his family forever, but it went wrong. Now the house takes whoever lives there one by one, adding them to his collection." Thomas thanked her and left, dismissing the tale as small-town superstition. Yet as he drove home through sheets of rain, unease settled over him like a shroud. That night, Emma woke screaming at exactly 3:17 a.m. Thomas rushed to her nursery to find her standing in her crib, pointing at the doorway with terror in her eyes. "Daddy! Bad! Bad!" she cried, one of the few words she'd learned. Thomas saw nothing, but the air in the doorway seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement. As he reached for Emma, the door slammed shut with such force that the walls shook. He lunged for the knob, finding it ice-cold and immovable. Emma's screams intensified. Thomas threw his shoulder against the door repeatedly, panic rising as he heard what sounded like whispering coming from inside the nursery. With a final desperate push, the door gave way. Thomas stumbled into the room to find Emma standing silently in her crib, calm now, staring at the corner. "Emma!" he whispered. She turned to him with a smile that wasn't quite right. too knowing for her young face. "All gone," she said, in a sing-song voice that raised the hair on Thomas's neck. Thomas snatched her from the crib and carried her to his room, where they spent the remainder of the night huddled together, neither sleeping. In the morning light, Thomas convinced himself he'd overreacted, but when he passed the portrait gallery on his way downstairs, he froze. The empty frame wasn't empty anymore. The outline had grown more distinct, the suggestion of shoulders, the shape of a head, and beneath it a small brass plate had appeared with a name: Thomas Miller. April arrived with no relief from the house's escalating strangeness. Thomas hired contractors to help with repairs, hoping their presence would normalize the atmosphere, but they rarely lasted more than a day before finding excuses not to return. "Place gives me the creeps," one electrician confessed, after repeatedly experiencing power failures in tools that worked perfectly elsewhere. "Like it doesn't want to be fixed." Only Mrs. Blackwood continued to visit, bringing casseroles and offering to watch Emma while Thomas worked. Despite his initial skepticism of the old woman, he grew to appreciate her quiet resilience. She never mentioned the supernatural directly, but her remedies, sachets of herbs tucked into corners, lines of salt across thresholds, suggested she knew more than she revealed. "The house is growing stronger," she remarked one rainy afternoon as they watched Emma play. "It's feeding off your presence, your energy." Thomas had abandoned pretense. "What exactly is it? A ghost? A curse?" "Neither. Something older." Mrs. Blackwood's weathered hands smoothed her apron. "Jeremiah Miller didn't just build this house, he bound something to it, something that hungered for what he couldn't give it." "Life," Thomas murmured, remembering Dorothy's words. Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "The portraits are anchors, keeping those souls tied here. With each new death, the boundary between our world and elsewhere thins." "How do I stop it?" Thomas asked, watching Emma stack blocks with unusual precision for her age. "You can't stop it. You can only leave before it's too late." But Thomas had invested everything in this house. Leaving meant financial ruin, meant admitting defeat. He'd survived war. Surely he could outlast whatever haunted these walls. That night, Thomas dreamed he was painting in the portrait gallery. His hands moved with impossible skill, capturing details he couldn't possibly know. In the dream, he was completing his own portrait, adding the final touches to eyes that seemed to blink as he watched. He awoke gasping, fingers cramped, as if they'd been clutching a brush for hours. Moonlight spilled through his window, illuminating his hands, which were stained with paint he didn't remember using. A soft humming drew him from bed. Following the sound, Thomas found himself in the hallway outside the portrait gallery. The humming grew louder as he approached, resolving into a lullaby he recognized, the same one he sang to Emma each night. The gallery was bathed in an unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from the paintings themselves. As Thomas watched in horror, the subjects shifted slightly in their frames. The elderly man, Jeremiah, he presumed, turned his head to regard Thomas directly. "She'll be joining us soon," Jeremiah said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "The little one. We've been waiting for a child." Rage surged through Thomas. "You won't touch her," Jeremiah smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too numerous. "We already have. Look at your portrait, Thomas. It's nearly complete." Thomas's gaze snapped to the final frame. His portrait was indeed nearly finished, capturing him in perfect detail, except for the eyes, which remained blank spaces on the canvas. "When the eyes are done, so are you," Jeremiah explained casually. "But don't worry about Emma. She'll be well cared for. Children are special to us, full of potential." Thomas lunged at the painting, intending to tear it from the wall, but his hands passed through it as if through smoke. Laughter echoed from every portrait as he tried repeatedly to grasp the frame. "You can't destroy what isn't fully formed," Jeremiah taunted, "just as we can't fully reach your world, yet." A cry from Emma's nursery broke through Thomas's panic. He ran to her, finding her standing in her crib, arms outstretched toward the same corner she'd been watching for weeks. "No!" Thomas shouted, pulling her into his arms. "You can't have her!" The temperature in the room plummeted. The rocking chair in the corner began to move on its own, slowly at first, then with increasing violence. Books flew from shelves, and the window rattled in its frame. Thomas clutched Emma tightly and fled downstairs, out the front door, and into the night. In the truck, engine running, he looked back at the house. Every window blazed with light, though he knew no electricity flowed to the fixtures. Silhouettes moved behind the glass, figures walking from room to room as if searching. In the upstairs hallway window, Thomas could make out a row of faces watching him. 7 completed portraits and his own half-finished likeness. "This isn't over," he whispered, putting the truck in gear. Not by a long shot. Thomas and Emma took refuge in a motel on the outskirts of town. Rain pelted the windows as Thomas paced the small room, mind racing. Emma slept fitfully, whimpering in dreams he couldn't protect her from. At dawn, Thomas called Mrs. Blackwood, hoping her knowledge might provide answers. She arrived an hour later, bringing books so old their leather bindings had cracked with age. "Jeremiah Miller was a practitioner of arts best left forgotten," she explained, spreading yellowed pages on the motel table. "He sought immortality through his paintings, believing he could capture not just the likeness, but the essence of his subjects." The text described rituals involving pigments mixed with blood and oils rendered from unspeakable sources. Jeremiah had created a doorway within the house, not to the afterlife, but to something older, hungrier. "The house itself has become the vessel," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "The portraits are windows, allowing those trapped souls to peer out, and eventually allowing whatever waits on the other side to peer in." "How do I destroy it?" Thomas demanded. "There must be a way." Mrs. Blackwood hesitated. "The house must be cleansed with fire, but not ordinary fire, and the portraits must be destroyed in a specific order, starting with the oldest, Jeremiah himself. And my portrait, it's not complete. That's your protection for now. The ritual can't take you until your portrait is finished, but it's working quickly. I fear you have days, not weeks." Thomas rubbed his temples. "What about Emma? Why is it so interested in her?" "Children represent potential, lives unlived, energy untapped. To such entities they're irresistible." That afternoon, Thomas left Emma with Mrs. Blackwood and returned to the house alone. He needed documents, clothes, and the cash he'd hidden in his bedroom. More importantly, he needed to understand what he was fighting. The house stood silent under clearing skies, looking deceptively ordinary. Inside, everything was as he'd left it, dishes in the sink, Emma's toys scattered across the living room floor. Yet the air felt different, charged with anticipation. Thomas moved quickly, gathering necessities while avoiding the upstairs hallway. But as he prepared to leave, curiosity and defiance pulled him toward the portrait gallery. He needed to see what progress had been made on his own image. The gallery was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. Thomas's breath formed clouds as he approached the final frame. His portrait was indeed more complete. The eyes were partially filled in now, dark irises beginning to take shape on the canvas. "You've returned," came a voice from Jeremiah's portrait. "Brave, but foolish." Thomas faced the painting. "I'm taking my daughter away from here. You'll never have her." Jeremiah smiled. "She's already marked. Distance won't matter, but perhaps we can arrange a trade, your life for hers." "You're trapped here," Thomas challenged. "In these paintings, in this house. You have no power beyond these walls." "Are we?" Jeremiah's smile widened. "Look closer at your daughter, Thomas. Look at how she stares at nothing, how she speaks to empty rooms. We've been with her all along. Parts of us, fragments, clinging to her like shadows." Cold dread settled in Thomas's stomach. Emma's strange behavior, her fascination with empty corners, had the house already touched her somehow? "I won't let you have either of us," Thomas declared, backing toward the stairs. Jeremiah's laughter followed him. "You can't stop what's already begun. Return to us, Thomas. Your place is ready." Thomas fled the house, clutching his gathered belongings. In the truck, he examined what he'd collected from the study: Jeremiah's journals, architectural plans of the house, and ritual texts that made his skin crawl just to touch. If fire could cleanse the house, then fire it would be. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of fire would destroy not just wood and plaster, but the ancient hunger that dwelled within. The motel room became their war room. Thomas spread papers across every surface, piecing together Jeremiah Miller's macabre puzzle. Mrs. Blackwood brought additional resources: grimoires borrowed from secretive colleagues, historical accounts of the Miller family, and ingredients for protective charms. Emma grew increasingly restless. She would wake crying, describing the painting people who visited her dreams. During waking hours, she drew the same images repeatedly: a house with too many windows, faces watching from each one. Thomas discovered that Jeremiah had built the house on land considered sacred by indigenous peoples, a thin place where barriers between worlds naturally weakened. The foundation stones had been carved with symbols designed to widen this breach, creating a permanent doorway. "The portraits act as anchors," Thomas explained to Mrs. Blackwood, pointing to passages in Jeremiah's journal. "Each death adds power to whatever's trying to come through. And your portrait remains unfinished because you escaped," Mrs. Blackwood reasoned. "It can't complete the image without your presence." But time was running short. On the 5th day in the motel, Thomas awoke to find Emma standing by the window, having dragged a chair to reach it. She was scratching marks into the glass with unnaturally sharp fingernails. "Emma!" Thomas pulled her away, horrified to see she'd carved the same symbols that adorned the house's foundation stones. Emma looked at him with confusion, then fear. "Daddy, the painting people are coming. They told me to make the door." That afternoon, Bill Kinsey arrived with troubling news. "There are lights on in your house, Thomas. Neighbors reported seeing someone moving around inside." "That's impossible," Thomas said. "No one's been there for days." "Well, someone's there now, or something." Bill shifted uncomfortably. "And there's more. People are reporting strange sightings around town, figures that vanish when approached, voices coming from empty rooms." The boundary was weakening. Whatever was trapped in the house was finding ways to extend its influence. Thomas knew they couldn't wait any longer. According to Jeremiah's journals, the entity required a complex ritual to fully manifest. A ritual that could only be completed during the dark of the moon, 2 nights away. The plan came together with grim determination. They would return to the house that night. Mrs. Blackwood would perform a binding ritual to temporarily weaken the entity's connection to our world, while Thomas destroyed the portraits in the precise order required, starting with Jeremiah, ending with his own unfinished image. Then they would burn the house with a fire kindled from sacred woods and herbs, purifying the ground beneath. As dusk approached, Thomas held Emma close. "I need you to be brave tonight, sweetheart. We're going to make the bad dreams go away forever." Emma looked at him with eyes too wise for her years. "They're not dreams, Daddy. They're hungry." Night fell as they approached the house, which loomed against the starless sky like a jagged wound. Every window blazed with light that shifted between sickly green and bloody red. The front door hung open, an invitation or a threat. Mrs. Blackwood began her preparations on the lawn, creating a circle of protection using salt, iron filings, and her own blood. Inside this boundary, she placed Emma with strict instructions not to leave, no matter what she saw or heard. Thomas checked the flamethrower he'd jury-rigged from hardware store components, then strapped Jeremiah's journal to his chest. It contained the prayers of undoing he would need for each portrait. "Remember," Mrs. Blackwood cautioned, "whatever you see, whatever it says to you, it lies. Trust nothing inside those walls." Thomas nodded grimly. "Keep Emma safe. If I'm not out in 30 minutes, I'll know what to do," the old woman assured him. With one last look at his daughter, Thomas turned toward the house that had become his nightmare. The true battle for their souls was about to begin. The house welcomed Thomas with sighing floorboards and whispering currents of air. The foyer, once impressive, now seemed distorted, dimensions slightly wrong, angles too sharp or too shallow. His flashlight beam caught dust motes that moved against air currents, forming momentary patterns that resembled faces. "I know you're waiting," Thomas called, moving purposefully toward the stairs. "Let's finish this." The staircase creaked beneath his weight, each step requiring more effort than the last, as if the house itself resisted his ascent. Halfway up, Thomas heard soft laughter from above, a child's giggle that sounded horribly like Emma. "She'll be joining us soon," came a woman's voice, the young woman from the fourth portrait. "Children adapt so quickly to our world." At the top of the stairs, Thomas squared his shoulders and entered the portrait gallery. The paintings now glowed with an inner light, their subjects fully animated within their frames. Jeremiah Miller stood front and center in his portrait, hands clasped before him, eyes gleaming with malevolent anticipation. "You've returned to complete your portrait," Jeremiah observed. "How considerate." Thomas uncapped the container of blessed oil Mrs. Blackwood had prepared. "I've come to end this, all of you." Jeremiah's smile faltered. "You cannot undo what has been bound for generations. We are part of this house, and it is part of us. We'll see about that." Thomas splashed the oil onto Jeremiah's portrait and began reciting the prayer of undoing from the journal. The Latin words felt strange on his tongue, but he pronounced each carefully, feeling power build with each syllable. The effect was immediate. Jeremiah's image began to warp, his features melting like wax under flame. He screamed, a sound like glass shattering, as the canvas bubbled and blackened. The other portraits joined in, their unified wail threatening to shatter Thomas's resolve. The house itself reacted violently. The floor beneath Thomas buckled, nearly throwing him off balance. Light fixtures exploded in showers of sparks. From downstairs came the sound of furniture being hurled against walls. Thomas moved to the second portrait, Jeremiah's wife, and repeated the process. Her image dissolved more quickly, her scream higher and more piercing. 2 down, 5 to go. As he worked through the portraits methodically, Thomas felt the house's desperate rage. Nails shot from floorboards like bullets. Plaster rained from the ceiling. The temperature plummeted until his breath formed crystals in the air. Approaching his own portrait, Thomas paused. The image had changed. Now it showed him not as he was, but as he would be after death, eyes hollow, skin grey. Beyond his shoulder in the painting stood Emma, her small hand clasped in his, her expression blank. "She's already ours," his portrait self spoke, voice like grinding stone. "Look outside if you don't believe me." Despite knowing it was a trick, Thomas rushed to the window. In the front yard, the protective circle glowed faintly in the darkness. Inside it, Mrs. Blackwood knelt, her lips moving in constant prayer. But Emma was gone. "Emma!" Thomas shouted, panic surging through him. "Here, Daddy!" came her voice from behind him. Thomas whirled to find Emma standing in the doorway of the portrait gallery, her nightgown dirty, her feet bare and bloody, as if she'd walked across broken glass. "Emma, you need to go back outside. It's not safe here." Thomas moved toward her, but she backed away. "The painting people said I should stay," Emma replied, her voice oddly flat. "They said you're going to live with us here forever." Thomas's heart sank as he realized this wasn't truly his daughter. "You're not Emma." The thing wearing his daughter's form smiled, revealing teeth too numerous, too sharp. "Not anymore." From outside came Mrs. Blackwood's desperate cry, confirming his worst fear. The real Emma was still in the protective circle. This was the house's final deception. Thomas turned back to his portrait and doused it liberally with oil. As he began the prayer, the false Emma lunged at him, fingers elongated into claws. Thomas dodged, continuing the recitation without pause. His portrait began to dissolve, the painted eyes running like tears down the canvas. The false Emma shrieked, her form flickering between child and something ancient. something never meant for human eyes. As the last portrait bubbled and blackened, Thomas felt the house's fury reach its peak. Walls cracked from foundation to roof, windows shattered outward. The floor beneath him gave way, and Thomas found himself falling into darkness. He landed hard on the first floor, pain shooting through his leg. Around him, the house was tearing itself apart, unable to maintain its structure without the portrait's power. Thomas crawled toward the front door, trailing blood from a dozen cuts. Outside, Mrs. Blackwood saw him emerge and broke the protective circle, rushing to help him across the lawn. The real Emma ran to him, throwing her small arms around his neck. "The painting people are screaming, Daddy," she whispered. "They're so angry." From a safe distance, they watched as the house continued its self-destruction. Thomas ignited the flamethrower, sending a stream of sacred fire through the broken windows. The flames caught quickly, unnatural in their violet-blue hue and intensity. The fire consumed the Miller house with hungry efficiency, collapsing its corrupted frame and purifying the ground beneath. As the flames reached their peak, Thomas thought he saw figures writhing within the inferno, 7 distinct shapes, and an 8th, half-formed one, all burning away to nothing. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering ash and the stone foundation, its carved symbols now cracked and powerless. "It's over," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice hoarse from hours of prayer. "The doorway is closed." Thomas held Emma close, watching her face for any sign of lingering influence. Her eyes were clear, her smile genuine. Whatever connection the house had forged with her had been severed. "Where will you go now?" Mrs. Blackwood asked as they prepared to leave Haverbrook behind. Thomas looked at his daughter, who had fallen asleep in his arms, peaceful for the first time in months. "Somewhere with no history, somewhere we can start fresh." As they drove away, Thomas didn't look back at the scorched earth where the Miller house had stood. He didn't see the thin wisp of smoke that rose from the ashes, forming momentarily into the outline of a frame. Empty, waiting. Summer, 1948. Thomas and Emma settled into a small bungalow in a growing suburb outside Philadelphia. The neighborhood was new, houses sprouting on recently cleared farmland. No history, no shadows, exactly what Thomas had sought. Emma had just celebrated her 2nd birthday with a small party in their backyard. She was thriving, with no apparent memory of the horrors at the Miller house. Her nightmares had faded, replaced by the ordinary dreams of childhood. Thomas found work as a carpenter, his skills in high demand as the housing boom continued. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, and the steady income allowed him to provide Emma with the stability she deserved. They might have continued this way indefinitely, healing gradually, had Thomas not received the letter postmarked from Haverbrook. Mrs. Blackwood's handwriting was shaky but legible. "Dear Thomas, I pray this letter finds you and Emma well. I write with troubling news. Construction has begun on the Miller property. Despite my warnings, the bank has sold the land to developers who plan to build several homes on the subdivided lots. Workers report strange occurrences, tools disappearing, unexplained cold spots, and most concerning, a persistent smell of oil paint where no paint is being used. I fear what was bound to that land cannot be so easily destroyed. The entity may be weakened, but it is patient. It will wait for new vessels, new anchors. There is more. During the excavation, workers uncovered a hidden cellar beneath where the portrait gallery stood. Inside, they found canvases, dozens of blank canvases prepared with a substance I dare not describe. More than seven portraits were planned, Thomas. Jeremiah's ambition was greater than we understood. I have done what I can to disrupt the construction. Old women like me are easily dismissed as superstitious fools. But I believe you must return. Not to stay, but to finish what we started. There are rituals to salt the earth, to render it truly barren to such influences. I would not ask if there were any other way. Please come soon. The foundations are nearly complete. With grave concern, Edith Blackwood Thomas read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his desk drawer. For weeks he tried to ignore its implications, focusing instead on Emma's laughter, on building their new life. But at night, Thomas found himself sketching faces from memory, Jeremiah Miller's stern countenance, the hollow eyes of his own unfinished portrait. The drawings grew more detailed, more lifelike, until Thomas began burning them at dawn, troubled by their accuracy. Then Emma started drawing houses again. "What's this, sweetheart?" Thomas asked one evening, finding her surrounded by crayon drawings. "The old house," Emma replied without looking up. "It misses us." Thomas gathered the drawings with trembling hands. Each showed the Miller house, not as it had been when they left it, a burning shell, but fully restored, windows blazing with colored light. That night, Thomas called Mrs. Blackwood from the corner drugstore. "They've found something else," she told him, voice crackling with static. "A journal hidden in the walls. It speaks of a grand working requiring 13 souls, not 7. Jeremiah was building toward something larger." "The house is gone," Thomas insisted. "We destroyed it." "The house was merely the vessel. What it contained, that's not so easily eliminated." Mrs. Blackwood paused. "Emma is still connected, isn't she?" Thomas couldn't bring himself to answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "You must return, Thomas. Not for long, 3 days at most. We'll perform the ritual during the new moon. After that, you and Emma can truly be free." 2 days later, Thomas and Emma crossed the Haverbrook town limits. The familiar landscape brought no comfort, only a creeping dread that intensified as they approached the Miller property. Where the Victorian mansion had stood, bulldozers now sculpted the earth for modern ranch-style homes. Foundations had been poured for 3 houses, with frames beginning to rise on 2. Mrs. Blackwood met them at her cottage on Orchard Street. Age had carved deeper lines in her face, but her eyes remained sharp, watchful. "It's worse than I wrote," she confessed after Emma had been settled for a nap. "Workers keep quitting. 3 have been injured in unusual accidents, and the foreman reported finding half-completed portraits leaning against the trees one morning. By afternoon, they'd vanished." That evening, they visited the construction site under cover of darkness. Mrs. Blackwood led them to the excavated cellar, a raw wound in the earth where the house's foundation had been. The journals were found there. She indicated a section of stone wall that remained intact. Behind that stone, Thomas examined the wall, finding faint traces of the symbols he remembered from Jeremiah's journals. "He hid his true intentions," Thomas murmured. "The 7 portraits were just preparation." Mrs. Blackwood nodded grimly. The 13th soul would complete the doorway permanently. No more thin places, no more barriers. For 3 days, they prepared for the ritual. Mrs. Blackwood taught Thomas prayers of banishment in languages that made his tongue ache. They gathered rare herbs and minerals, creating mixtures that would purify the corrupted ground. Emma watched these preparations with unsettling intensity, sometimes humming tunes Thomas recognized from their time in the Miller house. On the night of the new moon, they returned to the construction site. The darkness was absolute. No stars, no distant lights from town. Thomas carried Emma, who had fallen into an unusually deep sleep despite the tension surrounding them. Mrs. Blackwood began marking the boundaries of the property with iron stakes and salt lines. Thomas placed purifying bundles at each corner of the former house's foundation. As midnight approached, Mrs. Blackwood positioned herself at the head of the cellar hole, Thomas at its foot. Between them lay Emma, still sleeping, surrounded by a circle of protection. "Whatever happens," Mrs. Blackwood cautioned, "do not break the circle until the ritual is complete." They began the banishment, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to bend the darkness around them. The air grew thick, difficult to breathe. The ground beneath them trembled, first subtly, then with increasing violence. From the cellar hole rose tendrils of darkness deeper than the night itself. They probed the air, seeking weakness, finding none in the carefully constructed boundaries. As the ritual reached its climax, Thomas felt rather than heard a scream of rage. Ancient, hungry, denied. The tendrils whipped frantically, then began to dissolve like smoke in wind. Emma's eyes snapped open. She sat up within her protective circle, watching the dissipating darkness with an expression Thomas couldn't interpret. "The painting people are going away," she announced calmly. "They can't find the door anymore." The ground gave one final shudder, then stilled. Mrs. Blackwood slumped to her knees, exhausted by the ritual's demands. Thomas rushed to check on her, finding her pale but conscious. "It's done," she whispered. "The binding is broken." As dawn approached, they performed one final act. Using a mixture of salt, iron, and blessed water, they drenched the excavated cellar and the surrounding earth. Where the liquid touched, the ground hissed and steamed, releasing acrid fumes that quickly dispersed in the morning air. "The land will remember," Mrs. Blackwood warned as they prepared to leave. "It may try again, generations from now, when all who remember are gone." Thomas looked at the construction site, now just dirt and concrete in the pale morning light. "Then someone else will have to finish it. For us, it's over." Autumn 1957. Emma Miller, age 11, sat at her school desk, pencil moving across paper with unusual precision. Her art teacher, Mrs. Conrad, watched over her shoulder with poorly concealed amazement. "You have a remarkable gift, Emma," Mrs. Conrad said. "These portraits are extraordinarily lifelike." Emma nodded without looking up, the face taking shape beneath her pencil. An elderly woman with knowing eyes was nearly complete. Only the final details of the eyes remained unfinished. "Who is she?" Mrs. Conrad asked. "A relative. Mrs. Blackwood," Emma replied softly. "She died last week." Thomas received the call at work. Emma had fainted during art class, her teacher unable to wake her for several minutes. By the time Thomas arrived at the school, Emma was conscious but disoriented, unable to recall what had happened. The drawing still lay on her desk, a perfect likeness of Edith Blackwood, who had indeed passed away peacefully in her sleep 7 days earlier, though they hadn't yet received word from Haverbrook. That night, Thomas found Emma in her room, surrounded by drawings, dozens of them, all faces. Some he recognized, Jeremiah Miller, the other subjects from the portrait gallery. Others were strangers, their features rendered with the same uncanny accuracy. "Emma," Thomas said carefully, "where did these come from?" "I see them sometimes," Emma explained, sorting the drawings into neat piles. "When I close my eyes, they want me to remember them." Cold fear clutched at Thomas's heart. "The painting people? From the old house?" Emma nodded. "They're still waiting, Daddy." They found another way. The following day, Thomas called the only person who might understand, Bill Kinsey, still running the hardware store in Haverbrook. The development was abandoned, Bill confirmed. Too many accidents, too many strange occurrences. The bank foreclosed last spring. The land's been empty since. And Mrs. Blackwood's cottage, a hesitation. Sold last month to a young couple from out of state. Artists, I believe. They're renovating it into a studio. Thomas hung up, mind racing. The connection had never been fully severed, not with the land, not with what dwelled there. It had simply found new vessels, new anchors. Over the next year, Thomas watched Emma carefully. Her artistic talent flourished, earning recognition in local exhibitions. But she drew only landscapes and still lifes for public viewing. The portraits, increasingly detailed, increasingly numerous, she created in private, hiding them between mattress and box spring when finished. Thomas found them while changing her sheets, nearly 50 portraits, each more lifelike than the last. Most depicted strangers, but some showed people from their Philadelphia neighborhood. The final drawing in the stack was of Thomas himself, his features captured with loving precision. Only the eyes remained unfinished, blank spaces in an otherwise perfect likeness. That night, Thomas burned the drawings in the backyard grill, watching the faces curl and blacken in the flames. As the last portrait, his own, caught fire, he felt a sharp pain behind his eyes, so intense he fell to his knees. When the pain subsided, Thomas looked up to find Emma watching from her bedroom window, her expression unreadable in the darkness. They moved again the following week. Thomas accepted a job offer in California, putting 3,000 miles between them and Pennsylvania. He enrolled Emma in a new school, encouraged her interest in mathematics and science, and stored her art supplies in the attic where they gathered dust. For a time, it seemed to work. Emma's teenage years passed without incident. She excelled academically, made friends, and showed no interest in returning to art. The nightmares that had plagued her childhood faded, replaced by the ordinary concerns of adolescence. Thomas allowed himself to hope they had escaped whatever influence had reached for them from Haverbrook. Perhaps distance had finally broken the connection. Perhaps whatever waited there had found other, more receptive vessels. Then came Emma's 18th birthday, and the letter that arrived with it, postmarked from Haverbrook, addressed in handwriting Thomas didn't recognize, but somehow knew. He intercepted it before Emma could see, tearing it open in the privacy of his workshop. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a carefully drawn, empty frame. Below it, in elegant script, the collection remains incomplete. The door awaits its final key. Thomas destroyed the letter, but its message lingered like poison in his veins. That night, he dreamed of the portrait gallery, not as it had been, but as it might become. 13 frames hung on walls that stretched impossibly into darkness. 7 held completed portraits, faces Thomas remembered all too well. The 8th showed Edith Blackwood, her eyes sharp even in death. The remaining frames stood empty, waiting. Thomas awoke to find Emma standing in his doorway, watching him with eyes that reflected too much light in the darkness. "I remembered something tonight," she said, her voice oddly distant, "about the house, about what it wanted." Thomas sat up slowly. "What did it want, Emma?" "Not 13 souls," she replied. 13 generations. Jeremiah was building something that would outlast him, outlast all of us. The portraits were just the foundation. Thomas felt the weight of understanding settle over him. They had never escaped, merely postponed the inevitable. Whatever had been bound to that house, to that land, had patience beyond human comprehension. It could wait decades, centuries if necessary, maintaining its tenuous connection through bloodlines and memory. "It's still with you," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Emma nodded. "It always has been. But I'm stronger now. I understand what it is, what it wants, and I've learned to say no." In the years that followed, Emma developed her own rituals of containment, not to destroy the connection, but to control it. She returned to art on her own terms, creating beauty instead of capturing souls. When she married and had children of her own, she watched them carefully for signs of inherited sensitivity, teaching them protection when needed. Thomas lived to see grandchildren finding peace in their ordinary joys and challenges. He never returned to Pennsylvania, never spoke of the Miller house again. But sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, he thought he heard the soft sound of brushstrokes from empty rooms and felt the weight of unfinished eyes upon him. In a development outside Haverbrook, built on land once occupied by a Victorian mansion, 13 houses now stand in a perfect circle. Their occupants report occasional oddities, dreams of paintings that change overnight, children who sketch faces they've never seen, the lingering scent of oil paint in rooms never used for art. Inside each home, hanging in upstairs hallways, are empty frames waiting to be filled. The collection remains incomplete. The door awaits its final key.